In this video I'll review the basic ideas of argument evaluation and then go on in the next video to look at an example. So to remind you, for an argument to be successful, for it to provide a good reason for accepting the conclusion, the premises should be acceptable as true and the premises should support the conclusion. The conclusion should follow from the premises. For a good argument, both of these conditions have to be satisfied, but they're independent conditions or criteria. An argument can satisfy one but not the other. For example, we might have an argument where the premises were acceptable but didn't support the conclusion, or we might have an argument where the premises do support the conclusion but are not acceptable. So I'll talk about each of these two conditions in a bit more detail, the condition of acceptability and the condition of support. So here briefly are some questions you can ask when you're evaluating the acceptability of a premise. First of all, look to see if the author has given an argument for the premise. If they have given an argument for the premise, then you should evaluate that argument. And you can accept the premise if you decide that the argument for it is a successful one. If the author hasn't given an argument for the premise, then the premise is unsupported. The question now is whether you can think of any arguments for or against accepting that premise. One reason you might accept an unsupported premise in an argument is if it's true by definition, true given the meaning of the words in it. For example, to give a simple example, every triangle has three sides would be something true by definition. If the premise is a general statement, a statement of the form all or everything of a certain kind has a certain feature, then one question to ask is whether there are any counterexamples to the general claim. By a counterexample I mean something like this. If you had a general statement such as all birds can fly, a counterexample to that general statement would be, well, any example of a bird that couldn't fly, a penguin or an emu, for example. If you can think of counterexamples to a general statement, then you shouldn't accept it. The counterexample shows that the general statement's false. Finally, it's important to think about this last point here. Would the premise be acceptable to someone who didn't already accept the conclusion? If the premise assumes that the conclusion is true, or presupposes that the conclusion is true, or wouldn't really be acceptable to someone who didn't already believe the conclusion, then the argument begs the question, and you shouldn't accept that premise as an argument for that conclusion. So the other condition a successful argument has to satisfy is support. The premises should support the conclusion. What that means is something like this. If the premises were true, or if the premises were accepted as true, they'd give you a good reason to accept the conclusion. Notice this just says if, so it doesn't presuppose that the premises are true. Premises support a conclusion when, if the premises were true, they'd give you a good reason to accept the conclusion. Premises may or may not be true, they may or may not be acceptable. That's why the condition of acceptability is an independent condition for an argument to be a successful one. One type of support that premises can give to a conclusion, not the only kind, but the strongest kind, is deductive validity. In a deductively valid argument, if the premises are all true, then the conclusion must be true. It can't be false. Here's an example. All philosophers are crazy. That's the first premise. Second premise, Sam is a philosopher. Conclusion, Sam is crazy. Well, although the premises, of course, aren't all true, This premise, of course, isn't true. Nonetheless, if they were both true, if it was really true that all philosophers were crazy and that Sam was a philosopher, then it would certainly follow that Sam was crazy. It must be true that Sam is crazy if both those things are true, so the argument's deductively valid. Whereas an argument's deductively invalid, or just not deductively valid, if it's possible for the premises to all be true and the conclusion false. So the truth of the premises doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. For example, very similar argument, I've just changed the first premise to some philosophers are crazy. Second premise, Sam is a philosopher, therefore Sam is crazy. Now this is invalid because even if both the premises were true, maybe Sam is one of the philosophers who isn't crazy. This first premise doesn't say all philosophers are crazy, it just says some are. So that leaves open the possibility that some are not crazy, and Sam could be one of those, so this conclusion doesn't follow. It's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, so it's not a valid argument, not deductively valid. As I said, deductive validity isn't the only kind of support that premises can give to a conclusion, although it's the strongest kind. Another type of support is sometimes called inductive support, to distinguish it from deductive. With inductively strong argument, if the premises are true, it's very unlikely that the conclusion is false. So the truth of the premises makes the conclusion more likely with an inductively strong argument. But it doesn't guarantee that the conclusion must be true, as a deductively valid argument does. There are lots of different kinds of inductive argument. Perhaps the most common is inference to best explanation. In these arguments, the conclusion is, if you like, a hypothesis which is offered as being the most plausible or likely explanation of the evidence stated in the premises. So here's an example. Here we have some evidence stated in the premises. The door to my house has been forced open, all the drawers have been pulled out and emptied, the television, the DVD player and the laptop are missing. What conclusion can I draw from this? That I've been burgled. Because that hypothesis, that someone's broken in, is the most plausible explanation of these facts that are stated in the premises. There are maybe other possible explanations, but that's the most plausible one. So with any argument like this, to evaluate whether the premises support the conclusion, the question is always, are there alternative explanations that are either just as plausible or even more plausible? So how can you decide whether premises do support a conclusion or not? There are lots of different ways or strategies you can use to evaluate support. I don't think there's just one right way to do it or one best way. Here is one strategy that's sometimes useful. It starts with the conclusion, and you should look at the conclusion and ask yourself, how could this be false? How could the conclusion be false? What are some possibilities or arguments, reasons, considerations, situations, examples that would count against the conclusion? Then look at the premises and ask yourself the question, well, supposing those premises were true, would they rule out or eliminate those possibilities or considerations or arguments that count against the conclusion? If they do, if the premises are enough to rule out different ways in which the conclusion could be false, then the premises do support the conclusion. On the other hand, if the premises are not sufficient to eliminate the considerations that count against the conclusion, then they don't support it. So just to summarise, the two conditions an argument has to satisfy in order to be successful these, the premises should be acceptable as true, and the premises should support the conclusion. Those are two different conditions. An argument could satisfy one but not the other. So when you're evaluating an argument, you have to consider both of these criteria separately. And I said that one way you could evaluate support is by thinking of possibilities, possible cases or situations that count against the conclusion, or in which the conclusion isn't true, and then check to see if the premises are sufficient to rule out or eliminate those possibilities.